The morning after my husband's funeral, my daughter-in-law walked into my kitchen, placed a folder in front of me, and said 6 words I will never forget. "You need to sign the house over." I stared at her, wondering whether grief had somehow made me misunderstand what she had just said. My husband, Robert, had been buried less than 24 hours earlier. His coffee mug was still sitting beside the sink. His reading glasses rested on top of the newspaper he had opened the morning before he died. The sympathy cards from friends and neighbors covered the counter, and the white lilies from his funeral filled the room with a fragrance I already knew I would never forget. Yet there sat my daughter-in-law, Vanessa, perfectly dressed, perfectly calm, discussing who should own my home. My son Daniel sat beside her, staring down at his hands. He wouldn't look at me. Vanessa pushed the folder a little closer. "Margaret, we're only trying to make things easier for you." Easier. I almost laughed. I had just buried the man I'd loved for 43 years, and somehow transferring ownership of my house to my son and daughter-in-law was supposed to make my life easier. What Vanessa didn't know was that 3 weeks before Robert died, he had changed something in our estate plan, something he hadn't even fully explained to me. And when our attorney eventually opened Robert's final instructions, Vanessa would discover that my husband had known far more about her plans than either of us realized. My name is Margaret Hale. I'm 68 years old, and for most of my life, I believed keeping peace in a family was more important than winning an argument. I swallowed hurt feelings. I forgave things without apologies. I gave people second chances, third chances, sometimes 10th chances. Robert used to tell me my heart was my greatest strength and my greatest weakness. I always thought he was teasing me. After he died, I finally understood what he meant. Robert and I weren't wealthy when we married. We built our life slowly. He worked as an electrical contractor while I spent 31 years working in administration at a local university. We saved every dollar we could. Our first apartment had a kitchen so small that Robert could touch the refrigerator and stove without moving his feet. We laughed about it. We didn't care because it was ours. Eventually, we bought a modest house. Then Robert started his own contracting business. The first few years were difficult. I remember sitting at the kitchen table late at night, helping him organize invoices, while Daniel slept upstairs. There were months when we wondered whether the business would survive. But Robert was talented, honest and stubborn. Customers trusted him. The company grew. We bought a larger home, then 2 small rental properties as investments. By the time we reached our 60s, our mortgage was paid, our retirement accounts were healthy, and Robert still owned a majority interest in his company. We weren't extravagant people. Robert drove the same truck for 12 years. I still clipped grocery coupons even when I didn't need to. Our only son, Daniel, grew up knowing the value of work, or at least I believed he did. Daniel was 39 when Robert died. He was kind-hearted, intelligent, and loyal, but he had one weakness Robert worried about constantly. Daniel hated conflict. If someone he loved pushed hard enough, Daniel usually surrendered just to make the argument stop. Then he met Vanessa. At first, I adored her. She was confident, polished, and ambitious. She remembered birthdays. She brought flowers when she visited. She called me Mom within 6 months of dating Daniel. When they married, I cried almost as much as Vanessa's own mother. But slowly, little things began changing. Vanessa became increasingly interested in our finances. At Christmas dinner, she'd casually ask what our rental properties were worth. When Robert mentioned retiring, Vanessa immediately wanted to know whether Daniel would inherit the company. Once, while helping me clean after Thanksgiving dinner, she asked, "Have you and Robert decided what happens to everything when you're gone?" I laughed because I thought she was joking. She wasn't. Robert noticed her questions before I understood what they meant. One evening, he closed his laptop and looked across the living room at me. "Margaret, Vanessa asked me something strange today." I looked up from my book. "What?" He hesitated. "She wanted to know whether Daniel's inheritance would be protected if something happened to their marriage." I frowned. Maybe she's just planning ahead. Robert gave me the look he'd used throughout our marriage whenever he thought I was being too trusting. People don't usually protect themselves from a divorce they're not considering. I told him not to assume the worst. Vanessa was our daughter-in-law. Daniel loved her. They had built a life together. Robert shook his head, but let the conversation go. 3 months later, Vanessa suggested that Robert transfer a part of his company to Daniel immediately. She arrived with articles about succession planning and tax strategies. Her explanations sounded reasonable. She said Daniel deserved security and Robert deserved to enjoy retirement without worrying about the company. But Robert refused. "Daniel will receive what I decide to give him when I decide the time is right," he said. Vanessa smiled, but I saw something change in her face. After that, she called Robert less often. Family dinners became tense. Sometimes the grandchildren suddenly weren't available to visit after Robert refused one of Vanessa's suggestions. I still made excuses for her. Robert didn't. Then everything changed. Robert became sick. What started as fatigue turned into doctor's appointments, hospital visits, specialists, and conversations neither of us wanted to have. One evening, after Daniel and Vanessa left our house, Robert asked me to sit beside him. His voice had become weaker by then, but his eyes were completely clear. He took my hand and said, "Margaret, I need you to promise me something." I squeezed his fingers. "Anything." He looked directly into my eyes. "Don't let grief make decisions for you." I tried to interrupt him, but Robert tightened his fingers around mine. "Listen to me. After I'm gone, people may suddenly become very helpful. They may tell you they're protecting you. They may tell you certain decisions need to be made quickly. Don't believe that urgency means necessity." I felt tears filling my eyes. "Robert, please, I don't want to talk about what happens after you're gone." "But I do," he said, "because I need to know you'll be okay." He paused to catch his breath. "Everything we built belongs to you first. Not Daniel, not Vanessa. You. Promise me you won't sign anything without Patricia looking at it." Patricia Collins had been our attorney for nearly 20 years. I nodded. "I promise." Robert relaxed against the chair. Then he told me he'd scheduled a private appointment with Patricia. I assumed he was updating ordinary estate paperwork. I didn't ask questions because I didn't want to think about wills or inheritance or life without him. 3 weeks later, Robert died. And before the flowers from his funeral had even begun to wilt, Vanessa arrived with that folder. She sat across from me at the kitchen table while Daniel remained beside her. "We've been discussing what's best for everyone," she said. I looked toward my son. "Everyone?" Vanessa continued before he could answer. "This house is too much for you now, Margaret. The taxes, the maintenance, the yard. You shouldn't have to worry about all of that by yourself. I'd lived in that house for 27 years. Suddenly, Vanessa had decided I couldn't manage it. "What exactly are you suggesting?" I asked. She opened the folder and turned several pages toward me. "Daniel and I can take ownership of the property. You would continue living here, obviously. Nothing would really change. Nothing except the fact that I would no longer own my own home." She placed a pen beside my hand. "This would simplify everything." I looked at Daniel. "Is this what you want?" His face tightened. "We're just worried about you, Mom." Vanessa touched my wrist. "You shouldn't have to deal with complicated financial decisions right now." And suddenly, Robert's voice returned to me. "Don't let grief make decisions for you." I closed the folder. "I'm not signing anything." Vanessa blinked. "Margaret, nobody is trying to pressure you." "Then there shouldn't be a problem with me saying no." Her expression changed. The sweet, concerned daughter-in-law disappeared for half a second, and underneath I saw irritation. "We're trying to protect you." "Then protecting me shouldn't require my signature the morning after I buried my husband." Daniel finally looked at me. Shame covered his face. Vanessa gathered the papers. "Fine. We'll discuss this when you're thinking more clearly." That sentence bothered me almost as much as the documents. She wasn't just questioning my decision. She was questioning whether I was capable of making one. 2 days later, Patricia called. "Margaret, Robert left specific instructions that I meet with you privately." My stomach tightened. I drove to her office that afternoon. When I entered the conference room, 3 folders were sitting on the polished table. Patricia closed the door and asked whether Daniel or Vanessa had approached me about any financial decisions. I stared at her. "How did you know?" She exhaled slowly. "Because Robert was afraid they might." Then she opened the first folder. What she showed me made my hands go cold. Credit lines, business debts, a second mortgage, missed payments, and correspondence indicating that Vanessa had approached a lender while discussing money Daniel was supposedly expected to receive from his family. "I don't understand," I whispered. "How did Robert know about this?" Patricia removed her glasses. "Vanessa approached him several months ago. She wanted him to personally guarantee a business loan. He never told me. He didn't want to worry you while he was undergoing medical tests. Robert had refused the guarantee. Afterward, he began investigating their financial situation because something about Vanessa's urgency concerned him." Patricia opened the second folder. "That's when Robert changed his estate plan." I stared at her. "Changed it how?" "Everything that legally could pass directly to you does. Daniel has provisions for a future inheritance, but it's structured through a protected trust." I swallowed. "And Vanessa?" Patricia paused. "Vanessa has no direct claim to Robert's estate." I sat back in my chair. Patricia explained that Robert's ownership in the company couldn't simply be transferred or sold without following the shareholder agreement. Our investment properties were protected as well. Most importantly, Robert had put safeguards in place to make it far more difficult for anyone to pressure me into transferring major assets without independent legal review. My husband had protected me before I even realized I needed protection. But Patricia wasn't finished. She reached into the final folder and removed a sealed envelope. My name was written across the front in Robert's handwriting. My hands began shaking before I even opened it. Inside was a letter. "Margaret," it began, "if you're reading this, I'm gone, and I'm sorry I couldn't stay longer. You spent your entire life taking care of everyone else. Now I need you to take care of yourself. Daniel is our son, and I love him. But loving our child doesn't require financing every mistake he makes. Do not surrender your home because someone makes you feel guilty. Do not confuse pressure with love. And please remember this. You don't owe anyone an inheritance while you're still alive. Love, Robert. I pressed the letter against my chest and cried harder than I had at his funeral. But when I finally walked out of Patricia's office, something inside me had changed. I was still grieving. I was still heartbroken. But I wasn't confused anymore, and I decided not to tell Vanessa what I'd discovered. I wanted to see what she would do next. It took Vanessa 4 days. She invited me to dinner at an expensive restaurant Daniel and I both knew they couldn't comfortably afford. The moment dessert arrived, she started talking about the house again. "I've been thinking about our conversation," she said. I realized the timing may have felt insensitive. I waited. But the practical issue hasn't changed. Daniel is Robert's only child. Eventually, everything is going to him anyway. I placed my coffee cup down. "Eventually isn't today." Her jaw tightened. "We're family, Margaret." "Then why are you rushing me?" Daniel shifted uncomfortably. "Vanessa, maybe we should leave this alone." She ignored him. "We have financial decisions that depend on knowing what the estate looks like." There it was. Not grief, not concern, money. "What financial decisions?" I asked. Silence. Vanessa looked at Daniel. Daniel stared at the table. Finally, he spoke. "We're having some problems." "What kind of problems?" He rubbed his forehead. Their debt was far worse than I'd known. Vanessa's business expansion had failed. They had borrowed against their house. Several credit cards were nearly maxed out. They were behind on payments, and Vanessa had been counting on Robert leaving Daniel enough money to rescue them. I stared at her. "So that's why you wanted my house?" "That's not fair," she snapped. "Isn't it? We weren't taking your house. You would still live there." "In a house I no longer owned." Vanessa lowered her voice when she noticed people at nearby tables looking toward us. "Robert would have wanted to help his son." I looked directly into her eyes. Robert knew. The color drained from her face. "What?" "Robert knew about the debt." Daniel looked up sharply. "Dad knew?" "Yes," Vanessa recovered quickly. "Then he understood why we needed help." "No," I said quietly. "He understood why I might need protection." Vanessa stopped speaking. 1 week later, we met in Patricia's office for the formal estate discussion. Vanessa arrived wearing a cream designer's suit and carrying an expensive handbag. Daniel looked like he hadn't slept. Patricia calmly explained Robert's instructions. The house remained mine. The rental properties remained mine. Robert's investment accounts transferred to me according to their designations. His company interest would be handled according to the shareholder agreement. Daniel would have access to a future inheritance through the structure Robert had established. Vanessa leaned forward. "What exactly does protected inheritance mean?" Patricia answered professionally. "It means those assets aren't simply available to satisfy unrelated personal debts or be transferred at another person's request." Vanessa's expression hardened. "So what am I getting?" The room became silent. Patricia didn't need to answer. Vanessa looked at Daniel, then at me. "I'm getting nothing?" "This isn't about what you're getting," Daniel whispered. Vanessa stood so suddenly her chair scraped across the floor. This is unbelievable. Patricia remained perfectly calm. Mrs. Hale, please sit down. But Vanessa pointed at me. You convinced him to do this. Daniel's face changed. Vanessa, stop. No. Your mother obviously manipulated him when he was sick. Robert would never have done this to us. I reached into my handbag and removed the document Patricia had told me to bring. I placed it on the table and pushed it toward Vanessa. Read the date. She looked down. Her eyes stopped moving. The estate changes had been initiated months before Robert's final decline. He had been mentally competent, actively working, and independently represented. There was no confused dying man for Vanessa to blame. Robert had simply been paying attention. He didn't trust me, Vanessa whispered. He didn't trust what desperation was making you do, I replied. Daniel looked at his wife as though he were seeing her clearly for the first time. 3 days later, he appeared at my front door alone. His eyes were red. He carried a thick folder under his arm. Mom, I need to tell you something. We sat at the same kitchen table where Vanessa had tried to convince me to sign away my house. Daniel opened the folder. He had discovered additional debts Vanessa had hidden from him. Nearly $80,000. Some came from her failed business expansion. Some came from credit cards he hadn't known existed. But that wasn't the worst part. Daniel had found messages between Vanessa and a financial advisor discussing what they could do once Daniel receives his inheritance. Those conversations had begun months before Robert died. Daniel covered his face with both hands. How did I not see this? My heart broke for him. I reached across the table. Because you loved her. He looked at me like a frightened little boy again. What do I do, Mom? For most of my life, that question would have triggered every maternal instinct I had. I would have started solving the problem. I would have called Patricia. I would have considered writing a check. I would have found a way to rescue my son because watching him suffer would have hurt too much. But Robert's letter was upstairs in my bedroom, and I could almost hear his voice. Loving our child doesn't require financing every mistake he makes. I squeezed Daniel's hand. You're 39 years old. I love you more than you will ever understand. But this decision has to be yours. Daniel stared at me. You're not going to tell me what to do? No. For the first time in my life, I realized that constantly rescuing someone isn't always love. Sometimes the most loving thing you can give an adult child isn't money. It's responsibility. 6 months later, Daniel and Vanessa separated. I'm not going to pretend I celebrated. A marriage ending isn't something a mother dreams about for her child, and I knew Daniel was heartbroken. But something surprising happened after he stopped waiting for someone else to fix his problems. He began rebuilding his life. He sold the expensive car they couldn't afford. He moved into a smaller apartment. He met with a financial counselor and created a realistic repayment plan. He accepted responsibility for debts that were legally his instead of blaming Vanessa for everything. For the first time in years, I watched my son become stronger instead of simply becoming more comfortable. Vanessa contacted me once during the separation. Her voice was softer than I'd ever heard it. She apologized for pressuring me after Robert's death. I listened without interrupting. Part of me wanted to believe every word. Then she said, I know things between Daniel and me may be over, but surely you don't want him struggling financially. Maybe you could help him clear some of the debt so he can start over. And suddenly I understood. Some people apologize because they've changed. Others apologize because their first strategy stopped working. Daniel knows I love him, I said, but he's handling his finances himself. Vanessa was quiet. You could solve this with one check. Yes, I replied. And then what would he learn? That was the last real conversation Vanessa and I ever had. 1 year after Robert died, I sat on our back porch with his letter in my hands. The garden he had planted was blooming again. For months after his death, I had hated the silence of that house. Every empty room reminded me that he wasn't coming back. But that morning, the silence felt different. It felt peaceful. I'd started traveling with 2 women I'd met through a widow's support group. I also began volunteering with a community organization that helped older women understand basic financial planning, property ownership, and estate documents. I was amazed by how many women told stories similar to mine. Women who had spent decades letting husbands handle every financial decision. Women who felt guilty saying no to adult children. Women who had transferred homes, drained retirement accounts, or co-signed loans because someone told them that refusing meant they didn't love their family. I always told them the same thing Robert had taught me. Love and financial surrender are not the same thing. Daniel visits me almost every Sunday now. He's still rebuilding his finances. It hasn't been easy, but he's doing it himself. Our relationship is stronger because neither of us is pretending anymore. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if Robert hadn't noticed Vanessa's questions. What if he hadn't met with Patricia? What if I had signed those documents the morning after his funeral simply because I was exhausted, grieving, and afraid of disappointing my son? I might still be living in this house, but it wouldn't truly be mine anymore. And that realization changed the way I understood everything Robert had done. His greatest final gift wasn't the house. It wasn't the investment accounts. It wasn't his company. It was the permission to protect the life we had spent 43 years building. For most of my life, I believed a good mother sacrificed whatever her children needed. Now I understand something different. A good mother can love her children and still say no. A widow can grieve her husband and still protect herself. And a woman doesn't become selfish simply because she refuses to surrender what she spent a lifetime earning. I folded Robert's letter and looked across the garden. There was one sentence I had memorized because I wanted to carry it with me for the rest of my life. You don't owe anyone an inheritance while you're still alive. I spent 43 years building a life with my husband, and I almost handed part of that life away because someone made me feel guilty for protecting it. Not anymore. Because boundaries don't mean you stopped loving your family. Sometimes boundaries are what finally teach your family how to respect you. And if Robert could have seen me sitting there that morning, finally understanding what he tried so hard to teach me, I think he would have smiled. Before you go, I want to ask you something. If you were in my position, would you have helped Daniel pay off the debt after discovering the truth? Or would you have made him rebuild his life on his own? Tell me in the comments, because I genuinely want to know what you would have done. And if you enjoy emotional stories about family secrets, betrayal, second chances, and women finding the courage to take back control of their lives, subscribe and join me for the next story.